Hello everybody, I'm Michael Sas-Rolfes. I'm a researcher at the School of Geography and Environment at the University of Oxford, and I'm also affiliated with the Oxford Martin Programme on Wildlife Trade and the African Wildlife Economy Institute. And today I'm going to be talking to you about the Southern African model of conservation governance and using rhinos as a case study to evaluate this approach to conservation. Now, in the Anthropocene era, conserving megafauna, large mammals in particular, is a real challenge. And these large mammals are uniquely challenging in that they compete for valuable land that could be used for agriculture or other reasons. They're often dangerous and they come into conflict with rural people, harming them and their livestock and livelihoods. And they also yield valuable commodities such as ivory and rhino horn, which also makes them very vulnerable to poaching for commercial reasons. Examples of megafauna include elephants, rhinos, big cats such as lions and tigers, bears, the American bison, and the African buffalo. Now, there are two really different models of conservation that both appear on the face of it to have worked very well in conserving large mammals. The one is the North American model of wildlife management and the other is the Southern African model. But they differ significantly. As you can see, under the North American model, wildlife is treated as a public good and private ownership of these animals is not permitted. Hunting is also controlled by the state, and there is no trade in wildlife products. So if you hunt an animal, a wild animal, you cannot sell its meat to somebody else. Southern Africa is very different, where there is wildlife in public areas such as national parks, but there is also a lot of wildlife on private land, and private ownership of wildlife is possible. Hunting is allowed outside of state protected areas. In fact, it mostly occurs outside of state protected areas. And wildlife trade is legal. Animals are traded live, there's a trade in wild meat, and there's a trade in other harvested products where that is allowed for domestic sale and sometimes international sale too. Now, the Southern African model follows what I call the theory of decentralization. And according to this theory, strong and evolved property rights over wildlife incentivize conservation on land that falls outside of protected areas. It incentivizes the people living with wildlife, whether they are wildlife ranchers or farmers or rural communities. It incentivizes them to look after these animals. And it does so by allowing them to gain increased benefit flows from multiple value sources, tourism, but also from trade, for example, trophy hunting tourism and so forth. So these provide wider and greater economic opportunities to those people. The state also benefits through this theory by selling surplus live animals to private landowners, and the money flows back to public conservation. So state parks agencies can also benefit financially from this whole system. And the indigenous peoples and local communities benefit from further sales of live animals to other parties, other private parties, and through the harvest from legal hunting for meat and other products. Now that's the theory. How well does this work in practice? And to consider this question, we're going to look at African rhinos as a case study. And I'm going to start off with this long time series chart, which shows the numbers of three different African rhino species and subspecies since the year 1973 till up to the year 2017. And you can see that in 1973, the overwhelming majority of rhinos were the gray color, which is black rhinos, and you can see they really declined. This was mostly due to poaching for rhino horn. And they've only started a slow recovery, but it hasn't been a very substantial recovery right up until the present day. Whereas you see the orange area, and that is the southern white rhino, and that the southern white rhino has grown spectacularly. And contrast that with the northern white rhino, which is the blue at the bottom. So why was the southern white rhino so successful? If we look at the history, it was hunted to near extinction in the wild in the 19th century, that's in the 1800s, and there was only one surviving population of less than 50 animals in what is today Umfolozi Park at the turn of the 19th century. And this single population grew under state protection in the park until 1960 to reach about 1,250 animals. But by that time, there were real carrying capacity concerns. The population wasn't growing anymore. There was overgrazing, there was bush encroachment, and the Natal Parks Board at the time decided something needed to be done. So they initiated what was known as Operation Rhino. This started in 1961, and what the Natal Parks Board did is they moved rhinos to other protected areas, both in South Africa and in neighboring countries, which were former range states, as well as some overseas zoos. And then eventually they started moving some rhinos to private land, to private wildlife ranches as well. And in 1969, they eased the provincial protection laws to enable legal hunting on private land, which then started in 1971. They kept on donating animals or selling them for subsidized prices to the private sector, but the demand really increased dramatically, such that at some stage they decided to start auctioning the animals to get better market prices. And so from 1986, the live sales were subjected to market pricing through auctions, and we saw the price of live rhinos skyrocket. Then in 1991, a piece of legislation called the Game Theft Act was passed, which gave even stronger property rights, recognized stronger property rights to rhinos on private land. And in 1994, international trade controls through CITES were somewhat eased to enable further trophy trade and the sale of live animals to overseas destinations. Now, what were the results of this relaxation and all these decentralization measures? Well, in 1960, if we compare these two biologically similar animals, the northern white and the southern white rhino, we see that in 1960 there were almost double the amount of northern white rhinos than there were of southern white rhinos. There were 2,360 in 4 or 5 range states in northern and central Africa, whereas there was only the single population in South Africa in one protected area. But by 2010, we see a very different story. By 2010, this northern white rhino had become extinct in the wild. And in that photograph, you see the world's last 2 surviving northern white rhinos, which is very sad indeed. However, the southern white rhino increased to something like 20,000 animals in 9 range states by 2010. So a very substantial difference. So some questions and concerns around this, though. What happened after 2010? We know that there was a renewed poaching crisis, and this increased poaching caused a decline in rhino numbers, especially in the Kruger National Park. But this was caused by a surge of demand for rhino horn, which could not be met through legal means because international trade in rhino horn is banned. But it was largely the poaching that caused the decline. So the question is, how well can this decentralization approach work for black rhinos and other species? Well, it has been attempted to some extent for black rhinos. For example, legal black rhino trophy hunting has been allowed in South Africa and Namibia since 2005, and that has brought in additional funds. But the viewing potential for black rhinos is a lot lower. They have very different behavioral attributes from white rhinos. They're much harder to actually observe. They hide out in thick bush. They're quite nocturnal. They're quite aggressive, whereas white rhinos are docile. So white rhinos are a lot more user-friendly. And as a result, black rhinos have what economists would call fewer private good attributes, and they are more like public goods. So black rhinos are a little bit less suited to this privatization approach, if you will. But now, is decentralization a good thing, or does it lead to domestication? That's a question I will return to, but first I just want to show you, by way of a diagram, the difference between rhinos on state land and rhinos on private land in southern Africa. And as you can see, rhinos on state land mostly serve the tourism viewing market, and you can see a lot of tourists just need a few rhinos to look at to be satisfied. So the area of land supported by tourism will be somewhat limited by that. And you'll see there's a small amount of rhino hunting on state land, but most of the hunting takes place on non-state land, on privately protected areas and communal conservancies. And you can see there's relatively limited tourism viewing. Most of it is hunting, but it supports a lot more land. And just 100 hunting tourists a year support a substantial amount of land compared with thousands, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of viewing tourists every year to the region. Also, very quickly to look at the financing models of the two countries. On the left, you see the market-based approach, which is used in both South Africa and Namibia for white rhinos and also for black rhinos in South Africa. And you can see that the sale of rhinos, that's the blue arrow from the flow from left to right, from public to private, then generates the funds which come back the other way. Both sectors benefit from tourism income and trophy hunting, although, as I said, it's primarily to the private landowners. And you can see other sources like NGO donations and so forth. But it works, the whole is bigger than the sum of its parts in this case. And Namibia uses a hybrid system for black rhinos, which is what you see on the right, where legal rhino hunting income gets paid into a game products trust fund, as you see on the far right. That then gets a portion of that then gets paid over to community conservancies, and another portion goes to pay for the rhinos, all of which, including the ones on private land, are publicly owned. They're just under private custodianship or communal custodianship. So a slightly different model, but it also works. Now the question is, what has happened to rhinos in South Africa and Namibia? And here are some very interesting statistics from the year 1993 to the year 2019. Unfortunately, I don't have recent figures for Namibia, but we can see that in South Africa in 1993, 17% of white rhinos were on private land. But by 2019, that had grown to more than 46% of a larger population. On the other hand, in Namibia, it had only grown by a small amount, but it had still grown. Black rhinos, on the other hand, did also grow in South Africa from only 3% in 93 to about 25–24%, stabilized around that level in the 2010s. And Namibia, it actually just stayed the same, but from 1993 to 2012. So you can see the private appetite for black rhinos is not nearly as great as white rhinos, and it has been much greater in South Africa, which has led to concerns about domestication. And here, this picture was taken on Buffalo Dream Ranch, which is the world's largest rhino sanctuary, now approaching a number of rhinos that probably is close to or possibly even exceeds the number of rhinos in Kruger National Park. This is a dramatic picture because it's taken at feeding time, but these rhinos are still essentially free-ranging. They're just supplementary fed in winter during the dry season. And intensive interventions are used, such as dehorning, but which are now widely practiced also in publicly protected areas. So the worry is that rhinos will eventually become farmed or become a domestic species, and how do we deal with this? And here's a little twist in the tale, and it relates to the recovery of the American bison. Now, the American bison was reduced to only about 1,000 animals by the year 1890. But it had recovered back up to 500,000 in the year 2020. But now most of those 500,000 animals are private, and you can sell meat and leather. But as I said earlier, the North American model doesn't allow this. So how is this possible? Well, it turns out that since the early 1900s, bison were governed under laws of agriculture and were treated as livestock and not subjected to the constraints of the standard North American model of wildlife conservation. So astonishingly, North America's biggest megafauna conservation recovery success happened with bison classified as a domestic or agricultural animal rather than a wild animal. So what does that mean for the future? Well, I would argue what we need to do is we need to urgently reassess the role of wildness in the Anthropocene. We need a framework to figure out what is wild, what is not, and how do we deal with the areas in between. Because what we have in Southern Africa increasingly, and particularly in South Africa, is a lot of areas in between. They're not pure wilderness, but they're not factory farms either. And we need a way to figure out how we can conserve the wildness aspect and how we can further incentivize it for our megafauna species such as rhinos. Thank you very much. If you're interested in further reading, there is a paper that is currently under peer review, but there's a preprint available for it that explains more how the legal hunting has worked for the conservation of threatened rhinos in South Africa.